allow me to tell you how I got into the Trails series. One day in early November of 2023, I don't remember the exact date, I was bored. After finishing many different games over the 4 months prior, I found myself wanting more. Around this time, I'd been searching for a good, decent JRPG to play, and the next time we'd be getting some of those was in January, February 2024, and I needed something to fill that void. The problem was, I was looking for a very specific type of game at the time. I had very specific ideas and things that I wanted to play. I wanted good combat, character customization, a good narrative, and good characters. And unfortunately, two of those things you can't judge until you actually play the game. So I decided to do what any responsible teenager with a decent amount of money in his bank account would do. I browsed the PlayStation Store. While browsing the store, I noticed there was the sale going on, and a lot of JRPGs were relatively cheap. After browsing a ton, I found two games that stood out to me. The reputations of these games preceded them, as I had heard about these two games all the time, being in the RPG/JRPG community, if you even want to separate that. Those two games were The Legend of Dragoon and The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel. Since you're watching this video, obviously I ended up going with The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel. And funnily enough, I don't actually remember why I picked it. I don't remember what made me pick Trails of Cold Steel. But what I do know is that I do not regret my decision at all. Since then, I've played almost every Trails game that I've had access to. Was that in the recommended order? Absolutely not. I played before when I got into it, I didn't even know the Sky and Crossbow games had existed, and before long, I played all of the Cold Steel games, which is something I regret to this day. Anyways, long introduction aside, I love Trails, and I wanted to review all the games, but I didn't feel like reviewing them until I had played them all. So instead of doing one individual review, I decided to review all of them as I ranked them. The way this works is that I'll list the Trails games that I've played from worst to best, from great to outstanding in this case, and then I'll dive into games and give my thoughts on them. Also, there are two games that I won't be including in here. The Legend of Nayuta Boundless Trails, because as far as I'm aware, it's not mainlined yet, and I also don't own it. And The Legend of Heroes Kurono Kiseki 2 Crimson Sin, which I own, but at the time of writing and recording, I haven't started it yet. With that, I think it's time that we finally get into the video. The first game on this list, and it just so happens to be the game that started it all. Now I have to admit, like I said earlier, I started with the Cold Steel games, and didn't make my way back to playing Sky until I was done with those. Funnily enough, I feel as though even if I had played The Legend of Heroes Trails of the Sky FC first, I don't think I'd end up playing the rest of the games. Here's the thing about Sky FC. This game, and technically its developers, know that it's a part 1. Now, whether that be because of budget or deadlines or because it was actually intentional, I don't remember off the top of my head, but they know it's a part 1. This allows them to focus on introducing the core characters and set up this vast world that is Zemuria. I consider Trails to be the gold standard for world building, and this game started all of that. Multiple different countries, tensions between said countries, and the story of the people trying to navigate the political tensions while also taking on a variety of challenges is so interesting to me. However, while the world building of Sky FC is its biggest strength, it's something I absolutely love about it, it's also its biggest weakness. Trails of the Sky FC, like I said earlier, knows what it is. It's setup. It's a part 1. Even still, the game's biggest issue is that because of its setting up, the game has a hard time trying to stand on its own. Now, this is just my opinion. This is how I felt about the game coming out of it. Right? The game has a hard time trying to stay up on its own. I absolutely adore the characters and the world that's been created, but I feel like there isn't a clear place for the plot to go until the finale. I, for one, just could not wrap my head around what the plot of this game was supposed to be up until like the last 2 chapters of it. Most of the game is following Estelle and Joshua on their journey to become the best bracers they could possibly be, while going to new places and meeting new people who will become important later. That's the key word, later. While I completely understand why this was done, a lot of the game is kind of sluggish to get through. It feels like a slog at times. The combat is great, don't get me twisted. Like all other Trails games, I absolutely adore the combat, and I love doing the side quests. But it's a story that really throws my feelings about this game off. And like I said, I adore this game. I still think it's really good. There's not a singular bad Trails game, but this just so happens to be the weakest because of that. My final score for Legend of Heroes Trails of the Sky FC is an 8 out of 10. There is a little caveat for that 8, and that 8 is given with the knowledge of what happens in the next game. I think if we're talking about the experience as a singular story, it's a solid 7. But with context, I could confidently say that Trails of the Sky FC is an 8 out of 10. And I also want to really quickly mention, you could argue that this game has the best cliffhanger out of all the Trails games. I personally think there's another cliffhanger that's better than it, but I won't deny that I was stunned when this part of the game happened. And by that point, I was already all locked in, so I was ready to go to the next one. The Sky Trilogy and the Crossball games do a really good job at world building, as I've stated. Particularly, there's this one word that gets brought up all the time during those games, and every time you hear it, every singular time that you hear it, you're filled with a multitude of emotions. Estelle has a line in Trails into Reverie that perfectly encapsulates what it felt like to hear this word. That word is Erebonia. Erebonia is the place in which The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel, aka my first Trails game, takes place. This game holds a soft spot in my heart. It's the game that got me into this franchise, has set me on this 7-month journey through this world. It's a story that's barely halfway done, or more than halfway done from what I know. I don't exactly remember. But that doesn't mean that I don't have my issues with it. A lot of my issues with Trails of Cold Steel mirror my issues with Trails in the Sky FC, but not as bad. I really do need to preface that I do like both this game's and Sky FC's story, but I still do have my issues, as I have already said. Cold Steel 100% is made better by playing the Crossball games first. That's on me. I didn't know. That's my bad. But even outside of that, I feel like I couldn't really tell what the story was up until about Chapter 4, and a lot of what messes this game up is its pacing and its characters. To simplify it, the pacing is weird. And there's too many characters. By the pacing is weird, I mean that when you get to the final chapter, the game feels like it has like another 20 hours left in it. Like 24 hours left in it. It's crazy. Then you get to that final chapter, and it feels like it's moving at lightning speed at times. Then there's the sheer amount of characters that you have to keep track of in this game. In the Sky Trilogy, as well as Zero to Azure, there are a lot of characters, but they're introduced over time, and they're given the time to develop, and develop the bonds in between these characters, right? Cold Steel 1 just throws 9 characters at your face and says, have fun. And what doesn't help that is the bonding system. Listen. I'm a big Persona fan. I like my bonding systems. I think they're a great way to give better insight into the characters themselves. The problem is that the game doesn't seem to want to commit to the aspect of the bonding system. They only give you bonding events for all of Class 7 plus Toa, and the issue is that they give you a limited amount of points to bond with the characters, which I don't think is a bad thing normally, but when the only characters you can bond with, minus Toa, are the characters that are in your party for 99% of the game, I feel like I'm missing out on important events and extra context about the characters that I'm supposed to be spending some 80 hours with. And because there's so many of them, it can feel really confusing. It really sucks because I know how much a good bonding system can improve a game, and this just isn't it. It's extremely frustrating. That being said, I still do love and adore this game. I love the combat, and the few characters who I did end up doing the bonding events for became characters that I wanted to see the stories of, and characters that I absolutely fell in love with. These are characters that end up ranking towards the top of my list of Trails characters. And I was genuinely interested in the world. Like, even if Sky wasn't my first game and Cold Steel was, by Chapter 4, or even earlier than that actually, I was interested in everything that was going on in the political landscape, and it already grabbed me, which is crazy. Which is crazy to think about how one game can do that. While I would highly recommend that you Sky first, I personally wouldn't blame you if you started with this game, as I think it's great for the most part, and a worthwhile play. As I said, it's what I did. I wouldn't blame you if you do it because I already did it. My final score for The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel is an 8 out of 10. The Legend of Heroes Trails of the Sky the Third is such a weird game for me because it's fundamentally different from most of the other Trails games. The story follows Kevin Graham and Rhea Sargent as they explore this dungeon crawling-esque experience that's not Liberl. Like, rather than exploring Liberl for the third time, they explore this world that they get transported to. It is essentially one massive dungeon crawler. An experience that can definitely be hit or miss. It's definitely hit or miss. I myself am not too sure how I feel about it. On one hand, I like dungeon crawling in this game specifically. I'm not a big dungeon crawler fan, but in this game, dungeon crawling was actually pretty fun. But on the other hand, I can't help but miss going back to Liberl for a third time and seeing what's changed post Sky SC. But it is what it is. One thing I will say though is that this is a really nice and respectful conclusion to the Sky trilogy. Sky the Third allows you to see into the minds and lives of every single character, even the ones who hasn't been focused on as much. Chapters such as the one with Mueller and Julia, those two get stories that make them into somewhat compelling and more interesting characters rather than, characters that you see and don't really care much about. And then the door system in this game allows for stories to be told, and I think is actually a really, really good addition. It's not something you would ever see in a normal Trails game or just a game in general, but the ability to see these characters navigating through their daily lives, or to see extra world building or set up for future Trails games is great. Now, some doors are better than others. I'm still waiting for whatever the world that one, what was it, Moon Door with the dragon and whatnot. I'm still waiting for what importance that has to the story now, but it's fine. Then some doors are just plain messed up. Paradise. But really good doors are really good. Overall, I don't think there's actually really too much for me to say about the game. The combat and gameplay is still fun, the overarching story is pretty good, and it has a really, really emotional send-off for these characters that almost got me to tear up. Not cry, but almost. It was really close. You get to see how Kevin in particular came to be, and you understand why he does what he does towards the end of Sky SC. And I think because of that, mixed with some of the other doors that tell backstories and Paradise, Sky the Third is easily one of the darkest Trails games, which I think for the most part is actually a good thing. I love that they take risks and are willing to go to places that a lot of developers and storytellers are not willing to go, for better or for worse. So, with all that in mind, my final score for The Legend of Heroes Trails of the Sky the Third is an 8.5 out of 10. The only reason why it's this slow despite that score is because I prefer a lot of the other games over it. The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 2 is another weird one. It picks up from Cold Steel 1's cliffhanger and makes a lot of decisions that I am mixed about to this day. This game has what I like to dub the Act 2 or Act 3 curse that this and Cold Steel 4 have, where for some reason this part of the game just isn't as fun to explore as the early and last parts of the game, right? And then also I feel like this game doesn't really do the Civil War justice. The Civil War in this game doesn't feel like the Civil War. It feels like you're outside of it, and I'm kind of realizing now that I feel like that's actually kind of the point. The fact that you're supposed to be outside of the Civil War, solving problems for the common people rather than being in the middle of the Civil War, and that's just an example of how ideas and thoughts about one thing changes. Because originally, I'm going way off script right now. Originally, I had here that I felt like there weren't that many consequences of the Civil War at Erebonia itself, and that the Civil War just felt like two groups of 25 people fighting each other. But now I'm recording this and I'm realizing that just wasn't the case. That Class 7 was supposed to be, outside, the third, there was that third path, helping the common people and doing things behind the scenes. And now that I'm realizing that I need to desperately replay this game. This game definitely needs to get a replay out of me, and I'm gonna have to do that soon. This game was also the game where I had to adjust how to play some of these games, right? Because I tried to take on the final dungeon and finish the game in one day, which I did, but it was a huge mistake on my part, because it doesn't help that the game has a final chapter and then 2 other chapters, the divertisement and epilogue, right after it. And those 2 chapters are also pretty long. It's crazy how long it goes on for. I had a free day. I started Cold Steel 2's finale, or final dungeon at the beginning of the day. I can't remember exactly where I started it. I don't think I ended up beating the game until like 9 p.m. that night. It was insane. And where this game lacks in the Civil War aspect, now not so much, but where this game lacks in its Act 3 issues especially, it makes up for in literally everything else. While the game still has the same bonding issue problem as Cold Steel 1, I thoroughly enjoyed the events of this game more. This game has more story moments that had me standing in my chair because of how hyped that was, even if I gotta spoil a few of them. Words of the wise, don't watch a singular Trails game or Trails content anything on YouTube until you finish all of the other games. I promise you, it'll make life way easier and you won't get spoiled on anything. Just take it from me. And while the consequences on Erebonia don't feel as major, and I still stand by that, the consequences don't feel as major on Erebonia as a place itself, but it feels the consequences of the Erebonian Civil War feel more major on other places in Zemuria, like, you know, Crossbell. And the next couple of, in the fact that the consequences don't feel as major on Erebonia itself rather than, you know, Zemuria, and the next multiple games going on cannot be overlooked. Everything that happens in Cold Steel 3 and 4 and Reverie because of this game. they all happen because of 6 games of setup and then this game's execution. If you really think about it, this game you can kind of thank for everything that happens in CS3, 4, and Reverie. And going further, this game is the catalyst, and those games are the aftermath, the fallout. It's crazy. And then this game has, I think, one of the most touching and emotional moments that I've seen in the Cold Steel games, and out of a lot of these games in general. The one that stands out is Reen and Toa at the end of the game, when Reen is just breaking down in Toa. You can see Reen for a very, one of the first times in a really vulnerable state, and seeing what he's been going through, and Toa comfort him, and not anybody else sees that he's just he's hurting, is really emotional. It's really touching. It really touched my heart. I loved it. And of course, the last moments with Class 7 and the Reverie Corridor before they all say goodbye was really emotional, and it was a lot. It was a lot to handle. It's the first moment in which Trails, because this was my second Trails game, where Trails showed me all of what it had to offer, the best of what it had to offer. And for that reason, my final score for The Legend of Heroes, Trails of Cold Steel 2, is an 8.5 out of 10. I'm going to be completely honest. When writing what I wanted to say for each game, The Legend of Heroes Trails from Zero was the one game that stumped me. I didn't know what to write, genuinely. I just did not know what to write for this one. Trails from Zero is an interesting game for me. I didn't really fall in love with the characters and Crossbell as a whole as much as other people did. I still really like it a lot, but not as much. But at the same time, I fell in love with the game's story. And it's weird because normally, for me at least, the characters in the world make the story. But with the select few characters that I actually loved in an area, while I still enjoyed, was kind of a letdown compared to Liberl and Erebonia, in my opinion. I thought that this game wouldn't place as high up as it did. But I think that's the charm of this game. It's not trying to go big. It's not trying to one-up the previous 2 or 3 Trails games, right? It's trying to do its own thing by introducing the characters and Crossbell as a whole, which sounds a lot like Sky FC and Cold Steel 1, which it is. But why is this game up here and not down there? Well, it's because they're not trying to go big. This game doesn't feel like it's set up. The game is everything a Part 1 should be, in my opinion. It leaves hints to what the future could look like and what the next game could be, but it feels like its own self-contained story. It feels like there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and not a cliffhanger, which of course I don't mind, but if a game or piece of media, any piece of media for that matter, doesn't feel complete, or like it earned that cliffhanger, I tend to like it less than something that tells a full story. A good example for this are the Spider-Verse movies. Into the Spider-Verse, I think, is a near-perfect movie with a great story and a great ending, while Across the Spider-Verse feels like it was just split up halfway down the middle, which it was. And there are other issues with that movie, but we're not here to talk about that. Trails from Zero focuses on this world, in my opinion, better than Sky FC and Cold Steel 1, even though I didn't like the direction taken throughout this game, and I prefer other areas to it. It focuses on this world by constricting you to a much smaller environment. It doesn't make it obvious that it's setting up world-ending stakes. And then in regards to the characters, I saw this on Reddit and it perfectly sums this up. This game, in Azure specifically, works more as an ensemble rather than each individual character being important or having amazing development. The characters aren't great on their own. There are some characters that are outstanding on their own, like don't get it twisted, there are some characters that are outstanding on their own, but a lot of the characters aren't great on their own, but together they form a really fun and enjoyable ensemble, and you can't deny that, even if you're someone like me who isn't in love with most of the characters. Along with the gameplay loop, some of the best side quests in the entire series, and gameplay and combat mechanics that I really started to understand, such as, the Sky Trilogy Orbment system, which I really didn't get how extensive that entire system was until this game. And Trails from Zero, throughout its faults and elements that I wasn't the biggest fan of, Trails from Zero still proved to be an amazing experience that made me sad about it being over. My final score for The Legend of Heroes Trails from Zero is a 9 out of 10. The Legend of Heroes Trails to Reverie is essentially Sky the Third, but better. And worse. But mostly better. This game absolutely carries over issues that games like Cold Steel 4 had, which we'll get to, but like we'll see with Cold Steel 4, which we'll get to, I still really enjoyed a lot of this game. Starting with the negatives, however, this game has 3 major issues in my eyes. These two, and him. And technically by association this, but mainly these 3. I want to start with these 2. Nadia and Swin are characters introduced to help set up something for the Calvert arc. Plain as day. It's clear to see that they're just here for setup, right? The problem is that while the setup is done pretty well, Nadia and Swin themselves are like sandwiches of nothing, and it's so unfortunate because you could read 3 and 9 and understand why they are the way they are, but that doesn't make them inherently likable characters. Now, I'll be completely honest, I'm more targeting Swin than I am Nadia, because I actually think Nadia is a pretty good character for the most part. The issue is that there's such a package deal that Swin kind of brings Nadia down, right? Their arc, if you hadn't read 3 and 9 up to that point, doesn't really invoke any emotion. Their dynamic is kind of annoying, which is unfortunate because they brought down like an otherwise excellent route that was hard to play through at times. Swin is just so unremarkable and boring and kind of annoying that he genuinely brings down Nadia, who I think is a really good and interesting character, which once again, like I said, brings down that arc and that route. Speaking of routes, can we agree that Lloyd kind of just objectively has the worst route in the game? And some of that has to do with what I said about Zero and not me being not in love with a lot of the characters, but loving the ensemble. But because they're split up for most of the game, you don't really get to see that, which is really unfortunate. I also came to realize over the course of this game, in playing all these games, is that I'm not the biggest fan of Lloyd post Azure. I think Lloyd during Zero and Azure are great. But post-Azure, not so much, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he suffers from being a normal dude in an anime setting, which can be cool, but when one of your main characters, one of your main protagonists is trained and parented by a divine blade, and surrounded by people that are absolutely insane for a variety of different reasons. One of your characters is a member of the Gralsritter. One of them has a company that's been involved in a multitude of dangerous situations, for better or for worse. And then one of them is Rean Schwarzer. And then add on to that him not getting as compelling a story as the rest. In my opinion, personally, he doesn't have that much of a compelling story, or as compelling a story as the other two, his story is still relatively compelling, but not as compelling as the others. He definitely does fall a bit flat. The other issue with his route, and it's so unfortunate, leave Crossbell alone. Like Yuna said in that one scene in Cold Steel 3, leave Crossbell alone. Like, we really just need to move on from Crossbell for a bit, because we're getting to a point where now we're reusing plot points from multiple games ago. Crossbell constantly getting invaded and taken over aside, I'm realizing that after beating this game's story, the main story at least, that this game is literally just Azure. Hence why Azure is like way higher up on this game. It's Azure, but not as good, right? Like, we fight and defeat an evil person who takes over Crossbell. Something spawns in Crossbell, middle of nowhere, right? And we need to go climb it. Then some random BS happens up there, and we need to all escape. Like, beat for beat, shot for shot, word for word. It is just Azure. Pair that with Lloyd's route kind of being boring overall, outside of that factory section, which is amazing. That factory section with Lloyd and, C's group is phenomenal. It definitely brings down the game a bit. But this game does retroactively save itself with the other two routes. I'm a firm believer in the positives can absolutely outweigh the negatives if the positives are good enough. C's route is essentially about redemption and found family, and I absolutely love it. Nadia and Swin aside, the characters themselves aside, I do love the idea of these characters as well as Lapis making C a character that can be relatable and sets him on a path for redemption. C and Lapis's dynamics their dynamics is an absolute delight, and the amount they gain and learn from each other is really heartwarming and emotional. And then there's Reen's route. Reen's route, while being the most disconnected from the two, and at first I thought that wouldn't be the case because of how Reen's route and C's route interacted in the first part of the game, Reen's route is absolutely the most disconnected of the three routes. But I think it's my favorite. Funnily enough, I think it's my favorite because this route allows for Reen to finally complete this character development arc that he's been undergoing for 5 games by now. Which is crazy to think about. Like, this route lets him confront his own decisions, see what could have been if, he actually went through with what happened in the normal ending of Cold Steel 4, and then see his effect on the people around him and having them stand up for him. I think all this retroactively leads to, in my opinion, the best scene in the game during that entire boss sequence, right? I'm not going to say what it is because as much as this is like a trail spoiler kind of video, I do want to kind of leave things up in the air just in case you got to this point and haven't played all the games. But it does lead to, in my opinion, the best scene in the game. And then the Reverie Corridor itself is pretty cool. And the daydreams, most of them anyway, are really, really fun. I genuinely enjoyed a lot of the daydreams. I enjoyed these daydreams and whatnot more than the ones in Sky the Third, because there's more characters that I care about rather than just the Sky characters, because there's a lack of characters to talk about in that game compared to Crossbell and Cold Steel and whatnot. You get more characters to play around with, not just random NPCs or random dragons and whatnot. And of course, exploring the Reverie Corridor is also pretty cool. If there's one thing I'm still mixed on about, I feel as though they should have either committed to the story being either outside the Reverie Corridor or inside the Reverie Corridor, because there's no reason the truth of it should be locked behind post-game content. I think that's a baffling move. I don't think they should have put that all behind post-game content. It's weird. And it's cool. The final boss of the Reverie Corridor is cool. It can be cool, but it's still weird and baffling that they did end up making that decision. But I digress. Overall, this is 100% a game where the positives outweigh the negatives, forming a game that I had a ton of fun with between the gameplay and most of the story, and it's a rather satisfying conclusion to both the Crossbell and Erebonia arcs, but serves as a nice bridge to the Calvert arc. My final score for The Legend of Heroes Trails into Reverie is a 9 out of 10. Warning. spoilers ahead for The Legend of Heroes Trails Through Daybreak. I won't be going into specific story details, but I will be alluding to or vaguely summarizing things that happen in the game. If you are avoiding spoilers for the English release or just don't want to be spoiled in general, skip to this timestamp. I love a lot about this game, but at the same time there's a lot of stuff that I don't like about it. The Legend of Heroes Trails Through Daybreak is a complicated game, as it's up to this game to set up the new arc, the new setting, and a new gameplay system. Being the most recent Trails game I've played, I have a lot to say about this game. I want to start with the story, because like Trails from Zero, there's no cliffhanger, and it's one complete story, and I think I'd love it more if I loved the entire story. Don't get me wrong. Chapter 3, the intermission chapter, Chapter 5, and the finale chapter are all outstanding. They're all pretty good, and Chapter 2 is also decent. It is enjoyable. But I can't help but feel like there's a lot of things in this game that bored me. And a lot of that's my fault, because since I did literally every single side quest in the game, and I would actually encourage you to do that because you get a pretty cool side quest at the end. I did literally every single side quest in the game, but even then, the prologue in Chapter 1 didn't grab me as much as I wanted it to. And while Chapter 4 is probably one of the most important chapters in the game, the writing of it and the game itself just drags it down a bit. Granted, that could also be the fan translation that I played, and that could definitely change when the English version gets released in July. But overall, I think besides Chapter 4 and the first two chapters that didn't grab me all that much, I still really enjoyed the story. Like, overall, I think the story is pretty good. The characters, on the other hand, right? Is it bad to say that I think we have the worst cast of characters in the Trails game on our hands? Which is crazy to say, given that Class 7, exists, right? I said it once, but the SSS and Zero and Azure work better as an ensemble, whereas on the flip side, Class 7, in my opinion, has stronger individual characters, for me at least. None of them will ever touch the Sky cast in either categories. They'll never touch the cast of Sky, but that's besides the point. Daybreak has characters that I really like. There are some characters with very interesting and compelling backstories, such as Van and Elaine. The mystery behind their backstories and Van's friendships with, Rene or whatever his name is. I cannot, for the love of God, figure it out. His friendship/relationship with Elaine and reflecting on what happened to him was great, right? And that was really good. Just as a side note, I really do feel like that we need to kind of bring back canon relationships into this franchise, because you get people like Lloyd and Reen who, as much as I like the people that I picked, as much as I love Noelle and Toa and whatnot, I feel like that by being limited to player choice or restricted to that, you don't end up with a good, decent relationship that can grow and evolve, and you get good, decent interactions, like especially post Cold Steel 4, you don't get the full scape of that, where you have Estelle and Joshua or Oliver and Shara, and you're always interested to see what they're doing and what they're up to as partners, because it was a canon thing that was built up upon. And I hope they do take that route with Daybreak and Kuro too, because that would be ideal for the characters and whatnot. That's just the thing that I think about all the time. Another side note, some of the connective events didn't really do it for me, because some of them are definitely better than others, and it's stupidly clear to see. I think the system in itself is better than what Cold Steel was going for, but in terms of the quality of the events, I think Cold Steel has better botting events than Daybreak's connect events, just overall. Next thing, I wish they didn't withhold information for so long, which is another issue I'll get to in a moment. Another part of another issue I'll get to in a moment. They withhold information for so long, but funnily enough, I think that actually benefits Van at the end, because of withholding that information and waiting to the end and letting that mystery unfold, Van actively becomes a top 3 Trails protagonist for me. I love Van so much, and I just can't wait to see where they take this character in the future. Like, it's such a fun and enjoyable character to watch on screen. It's just great. Then you have the opposite side of the spectrum. I want to preface this next thing with, I don't like boring characters. Let me just preface this. I don't like boring characters. Some of them I don't mind, but for the most part, I don't like them. I hate boring characters so much that whenever they're on the screen, they piss me off. I'd rather have a bad character than a boring character. The problem this game has is that yet again this description of my boring character issue describes a very important character. Agnes falls into the trap of main heroine that seems/is really important but gets literally nothing to work with. What I mean by that is that they don't really get one defining moment. And Agnes, funnily enough, of the three that I could think of that fall into this category, she's the least interesting of the three. She's literally, what if we take Ellie and Elisa and do it again, but worse? All three have lineage they don't want to know about. Elisa and Agnes have relatives that are evil, so that we know of so far. It's weird. Ellie was the most 100% was the most bearable character out of all of these, and she's boring story-wise. It gets quite literally nothing to do outside of like maybe the latter end of Azure, right? But at least having her around is fun. And Elisa is a little more interesting, and come Cold Steel 3 and 4 has a lot more to do with the plot, and she just loses points of personality. Even then, that gets better in Cold Steel 3 and especially Cold Steel 4, even if I think overall that entire plot line wasn't handled the greatest. She's one of the characters that improved most during the time jump from Cold Steel 2 to 3, right? In between that 2-year time span, which we'll talk about when we get to Cold Steel 3. Agnes just kind of loses in every singular category. Like, how do you have a character that has so many of these circumstances and familial connections and make all of that extremely important to the story just to make her the most boring and uninteresting character in the game? And the one moment she does get is shared with, like, towards the end of the game, is shared with everybody else in the party. And by the time the game tells you who she is and her connections, you already figured it out. You've already clocked it. It's super obvious. And another thing, I think another issue is I'm just not a fan of the character archetype that they take Agnes. There are other characters that do that better, but I think just that overall archetype isn't. I don't really like it, like the goody two shoes kind of deal. Not like, Reen or Lloyd goody two shoes, but like Agnes goody two shoes. I just like, not for me, Chief. You can have that. Last couple of things, I thought I would have notes on the gameplay when I first played, but that didn't end up really happening. I wish there was a bit more variety of field attacks, but otherwise, I think the gameplay is really perfect. It is really good, and I can't wait to see how it's expanded upon. Last thing, soundtrack, hit or miss. While there are some misses for sure, most of the music in this game is phenomenal. It's just brought down by poor placement. There are multiple instances where tracks are put in places they just don't need to be in, or they kick in too early or too late. One example, right, and this kind of pissed me off because I actually love this song. One example, there is a song during the finale that uses the motive of another iconic Trail song from Trails to the Sky, specifically Sky at Sea. But in the context of it that is being used, it makes zero sense for it to be used there. In fact, there are like two separate, different occasions where this song could have been used. These separate occasions, like they could use it there and it wouldn't be as baffling as this. But I digress because just hearing the song itself made me hype as hell, so I'll allow it. I actually really like it. But I feel like that's more of a me thing than anything now. Trails Through Daybreak is absolutely something new for the franchise, and while some things are better than others, I still really, really enjoyed my time with the game. Like, don't get me twisted, I enjoyed a lot of my issue with this game, a lot of my experience with this game. It's just, when you're doing a review, I gotta get out the negatives and then do the positives. The positives don't really need to be said. The positives I can really say about a lot of the other Trails games. The story, for the most part, there's some, like I said, there's some issues writing-wise and whatnot. The story is pretty good. I like maybe half of the characters. The world is still amazing. World building is still great. Overall, I had a fun time with it. It's just, once again, you love something so much, the issues just can't be ignored. You have to properly criticize them a tiny bit. Also, a tad bit off script. I completely forgot to mention this in the main review for Daybreak. This is, just me going off of everything. I don't like Armada. I don't know. Some of those Armada characters just aren't interesting to me the slightest. So much so that I compare them to like Imperial Liberation Front characters. Some of those characters, don't get me twisted, some of those characters are really cool and interesting, but for the most part, I find just Armada uninteresting and kind of boring. Like I said, a lot of them remind me of all of the Imperial Liberation Front characters outside of C, or the Cold Steel 1 version of C. Yeah, it's really weird. I'm not the biggest fan of them. Anyway, but yeah, otherwise, enjoy my time with this game. I'm really, really excited to get around to Kuro 2 and experience that game. I'm really hyped to see what happens. Yeah, Trails to Daybreak, overall good game. My final score for The Legend of Heroes Trails to Daybreak is a 9 out of 10. I'm not ready to talk about this game. The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 4 is a polarizing game, to say the least. Trails of Cold Steel 4 single-handedly has some of the best moments in the franchise and some of the worst. Let me get the negatives out of the way. Act 1, gonna be completely honest with you. I haven't said this because I haven't actively talked about Cold Steel 3 yet. And I don't like Yuna. I don't like Yuna that much. Yuna is a character for me that is better as a pure side character rather than essentially the leader of New Class 7. I say this with Reverie in mind. Yuna does get better in Reverie than she is in Cold Steel 3 and 4. And during my replay of Cold Steel 3, I do find that Yuna is not as bad as what I remembered, but she's still not great. I still don't like her. Maybe it's because I'm not a fan of the hothead, kind of an idiot best friend energy type characters, right? There are a lot of those in other series like Xenoblade and Persona that I'm not a fan of, right? Those series that I absolutely love and adore and have those characters, I don't like them all that much, except maybe Lance. Maybe I'm not a fan of, over patriotic characters. I live in America. It is so unfortunate. I live in America. As unfortunate as it's to say, she reminds me of a lot of, white, over-patriotic, borderline racist men that I've seen. And granted, once again, that's over time, that gets better, right? It absolutely gets better over time. It's just, Chapter 2 of Cold Steel 3 happens, and you're like, alright, Chief, sir. But this is a Cold Steel 4 review, so let me stop ranting about Yuna for 1 second. Then you add on character bloat, which isn't as big as an issue as everybody makes it out to be. Like, it's not that, character bloat isn't that bad in this game, but it is still a problem, so to say. The first half, compare character bloat with the first half of the game just not being outstanding, just it being slower than it needs to, bogs down this game's first act, right? Even though Act 1 provides a really cool answer as to what happened in the world post Cold Steel 3 and how the characters, not just Class 7, but the main party from Sky and the SSS are navigating, everything has gone down. I think that's a really good answer. I think all of that is really cool. The rest of the game doesn't suffer from this though, like Act 1 does, because Cold Steel 2, Act 2 and Act 3 do have their slow moments, but also has moments in between characters and big moments that I absolutely adored. Moments like saving Reen when everybody meets on the airship, or because of that big meeting and the chaos that ensues afterwards, which is just a great moment in general, because Class 7 and Reen specifically finally get to, meet Estelle and Lloyd, or meet Reen becoming a Divine Blade, or, when we finally see the last Divine Knight awakening, right? The sheer amount of characters that you have access to in this you can play as is also great. But the game's finale is what kind of seals this game for me, right? Not so much the final dungeon itself. To be fair, it's not as bad as Cold Steel 2's final dungeon or Sky FC's final dungeon. It's actually pretty easy and quick to get through. But the fights and the story moments in said dungeon, right? We get to see characters fight and confront each other in these emotional moments. We get to see some of the best boss fight I've seen in the Trails franchise that I've seen in a while, right? I want to specifically shout out that fight against McBurn, of course. The fact that you get to see him at his full strength with the super arranged version of the Enforcer theme playing in the background, and then the lore dump that starts, just making you question what's actually going on with Ouroboros and the world as a whole. Everything about that part is amazing. And then the ending, man. This is the only Trails game that has made me bawl and cry like a baby. Others have made me like tear up a tiny bit, but this one had me actually crying. Both endings of the game did that. One for the emotional and just downright depressing turn I wasn't expecting to see, and the other for the fact that we finally get to see these characters happy and enjoying life. Like most Cold Steel endings see Rean going through the most unfortunate events possible, or just see him be extremely depressed. But it's great to finally see Rean happy in one of these endings. Cold Steel 4 is a game in which the good heavily outweighs the bad. In more ways, the Reverie's good outweighs the bad. Because even though there's some bad in it, every time I look back and I think about this game, I always remember how much I love the good in this game. Like how much like just the good stands out to me, and how much it just elevated my experience with it. And that is why my final score for The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 4 is a 9 out of 10. Now from here on out, in the top 3, all of these games are perfect. You won't hear me say too many negative things about these games. The only reason why one is above another is because I personally prefer one game to another. Unfortunately, this rings true for the third game on this list, which is here, simply because something had to be. The Legend of Heroes Trails to Azure is a game that was hyped up so much to the point where I thought going in it might be overrated or somewhat of a letdown. And let me tell you, that is far from the truth. Trails to Azure properly builds on the lingering questions that Zero left and handles it with extreme grace. Almost every singular character introduces Zero gets expanded in some shape or form, like some expanded story or combat or whatnot. It's amazing, and each story makes these characters so much more sympathetic. The way it intertwines with the overarching narrative of the Trails franchise as a whole is amazing, and I especially love the Western Zemurian trade conference scene and seeing it like from one side in Azure and then seeing another perspective of it in Cold Steel 1. And the same could be said for the game's finale and how it's seen in Cold Steel 2. Trying to figure out the timeline for the Crossbell games and then the first 2 Cold Steel games is really fun. And if you've played the Cold Steel games, or if you're playing the Cold Steel games before the Crossbell games, or the Crossbell games before the Cold Steel games, I would really encourage you that when you eventually get to the other side of that you try and compare the timelines and try to see where everything fits in, because it's really fun and it's really interesting to see. This game takes everything built on in Zero and just makes it significantly better. Every location, every character, almost every character. Poor Ellie does not get much. But other than that, every location and character gets built on in some way, shape, or form. There isn't too much for me to say about the game. Overall, like, there isn't much else for me to say because it's just a really good game. So really quickly, I want to tackle specifics of some of my favorite aspects of the game. Randy and Arya specifically get really compelling expanded stories that answers a lot of questions left over from Zero, and that makes those characters, in my opinion, some of the best in the entire series. And then the finale, man, the reveal of certain characters, who they are, how important they are to the plot, and in my opinion, one of the biggest and best plot twists in Trails just as a whole. In the entire franchise, that made me rethink how I saw Zero, and do craft of some things that happened in Cold Steel. Funnily enough, like this is a plot twist that just made me rethink how I saw Zero in the first 2 Cold Steel games. It was crazy. This game's finale is so good, and Reverie uses it again, right? It uses it again. Reverie's finale is just Azure, but not as good. And funnily enough, I think that makes Azure all the more better. Azure just becomes a better game because of that. So yeah, I love Azure. I really enjoyed my time with it. Even though I love it, it's only third, which isn't a knock against this game. It's just I just like the other 2 above it more, which honestly just speaks to the quality of the franchise as a whole. How high quality and amazing this entire franchise is. That being said, I cannot wait to go back and replay Azure eventually, and who knows, maybe it can rise up in the rankings. My final score for The Legend of Heroes Trails to Azure is a 9.5 out of 10. I think this is objectively the best Trails game, in which I mean there's literally nothing that I could complain about. Sure, I might have like the tiniest nitpicks about Azure that I didn't mention because they're nitpicks. That didn't affect my experience with the game overall. I don't have nitpicks with this game. I do genuinely believe that it is a perfect video game in every sense of the word. The Legend of Heroes Trails of the Sky SC is, without a doubt, the best direct follow-up game we've ever gotten. It has everything you could want out of a Trails game. I adore this game's story and its stakes that can not only affect the overarching narrative, but the characters overall, the characters themselves. The retreading of areas I don't mind at all, and I really enjoyed seeing these areas again and how they differ after going there with completely different characters. The evolution of Estelle as a character and how she grows from the, not gonna sugarcoat it, absolute idiot she was in the first game to this character who's now able to fend for herself without Joshua's help. She's extremely capable. She becomes a strong-willed and even more lovable character, making it all the more emotional when she eventually reunites with Joshua. On top of that, you get to see more of the political aspect of the series. How Trails makes politics interesting to me is so beyond me. And the implications of events talked about in the past, as well as events of this game affect the world and future games. And then, on top of that, all of that, there's the introduction of the series' overarching villains, Ouroboros. I briefly touched upon Ouroboros in this video because I wanted to save it for this game. I'm going to save that conversation for this game. The members of Ouroboros, while some definitely get more than others, are all interesting and menacing. They give this air of you, the player, are about to get effed up in a second. Weissman and Ren, and of course Louvet in particular, are insanely well developed. Weissman is just an evil individual, which I think makes that relation dynamic with the other members all the more better. Ren's air of mystery and what she is and why she is the way she is makes her interesting. And while you don't get a whole bunch of background, that background until Sky the Third, paradise. That setup for what happens in that game as well as in Zero is amazing. Then of course there's Louvet, whose story is intertwined with Joshua so well, and after hearing about the tragedy and them joining Ouroboros and how their backstory with Hamo affects Ouroboros and proceeds to affect the future is all top tier storytelling. It all also helps that this game OST is probably my favorite in the franchise, along with Cold Steel 2, which for whatever reason I didn't mention the Cold Steel 2 review is what I'm just remembering. Its OST is phenomenal. It has my single favorite song in the franchise because of what it makes you feel. And as amazing as the song Silver Will is, right, that's not the song that I'm talking about. Or Whereabouts, whatever, I can't remember off the top of my head. That's not what I'm talking about. The song that I'm talking about here is the song that's actually probably playing in the background, The Enforcers. Tying back into Ouroboros, this song is scary. It serves the Enforcers well, making them into this scary enemy force that can easily kill you in seconds. This game's music actively makes the characters better, which just makes it a top tier OST. If you couldn't tell, like I said with Azure, I adore this game. I think it's perfect. And while it's not my personal favorite, it's a game that I couldn't and still can't stop thinking about. My final score for The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky SC is a 10 out of 10. My favorite part of the video. I get to talk about my favorite Trails game and the only Trails game to make it into my personal top 10 games of all time. The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 3 is a game that grabbed me by the neck and never let go for a good 2 weeks. I saw a tweet, and I can't remember the exact phrasing of it was, but the basics of it are exactly how I feel about this game. This is one of the most unhinged experiences I have ever had with a Trails game, and with a video game in general. As I reminded us, I've beaten all the other games besides Kuro 2, and I'm replaying Cold Steel 3 currently. And I'm remembering why I fell in love with this game. Of course, the gameplay and music are amazing, and I would argue the gameplay is even better with the Brave Order system, so much better that eventually got destroyed in the next game, but I digress. New Class 7, I find that as characters, in my opinion, some of the characters are definitely weaker than old Class 7. I explained that I don't like Yuna, and then outside of Altina, who's probably the best Class 7 member overall, just in general. However, Falcom did an amazing thing with this game. They fully tackled the criticisms from Cold Steel 1 and 2. It's like they had something to prove. Outside of the bonding system, which definitely still needs some work. It definitely does. It does improve with this game, Cold Steel 4 and Daybreak. They tackled the old Class 7, and the fact that they were just way too big. By focusing on a smaller cast of characters, it allows each character to get the time to develop. That in regards to old Class 7, and this would be my only negative towards the game, is how some of them are treated in between Cold Steel 2 and Cold Steel 3. Trails as a whole has a problem with characters that are just a whole lot of nothing. Case in point, Machias and Elliot are absolutely a part of this crew, which is extremely unfortunate. And Gaius has this entire character development, character arc that should be huge, that is done off screen. Which is it was still a nice surprise to see, but it definitely shouldn't have been done off screen. Then you get characters like Millium, and oh my god, Millium is such a good character in this game. She's so much better. She's actually bearable, which made a lot of this game's emotional impact hit harder. Like, I actually really like Millium in this game. She's a fun character, and it's crazy how that happened. I could stand Millium in Cold Steel 1 and 2, and Cold Steel 3, Millium comes along, and I'm like, this character is amazing, man. Cold Steel 3 also proves another variety of issues from Cold Steel 1 and 2. How there's more opportunities to see characters bond outside of the bonding events, and well, like I said, bonding events even just still aren't perfect. At least there are other opportunities to get to know the characters, which is a nice touch. Once again, another thing, I heard this in another YouTube video that I can't remember the name of, and wholeheartedly agree. Cold Steel 1 and 2 feels like a Class 7 story told from Reen's perspective, while Cold Steel 3 feels like a Reen story. They actually focus on developing Reen past high school and put him into a better leadership position that gives them extra depth, and I absolutely adore it. I also love the signature interconnectivity that Trails is known for, with bringing back characters and making them important to the story, and in my opinion, this game actually just does that the best. Between seeing Tina and Agate in the first bit of the game, and then Randy, is throughout the game, and Tio when you go back to Crossfall and whatnot, it's just nice to see. It makes me so happy. And then while I'm talking about this game, I also want to talk about the villains. Not Osborn, because Osborn's amazing, but yeah, I don't really have to say much about him. We all know he's great. We all know he's like top 10 JRPG villains. But Ouroboros, I've seen a lot of complaints out there that like Ouroboros has villains post Sky SC, between what they actually contribute and that one quote from Cold Steel 4. And that quote, while true, I think is the appeal and allure of Ouroboros, because at least for me, every time a member of Ouroboros popped up on my screen, no matter how significant, I always ask, what could they possibly be up to? And I think that's what makes them such great villains. The fact that you never know what they're thinking or planning, and they're scheming something in the shadows, right? So that looming threat is always there. Granted, yes, they haven't reached the peak that they reached the Sky SC, but all things considered, I think Ouroboros is a really good villain organization that just works for the series, especially this game's story and how their plans overlap with Osborn's. Funnily enough, I try to see the good in everything in regards to a story. Being a writer myself, I like to take everything into account and attempt to find the good, which ironically makes me criticize the bad more and makes me more upset about the bad. And Ouroboros doesn't do that for me. And as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that Ouroboros reminds me of just comic book villains, which, now that I'm making this connection, is amazing. It's actually really good. Lastly, in my opinion, this game has the best ending in the franchise. And me personally, I think it's personally better than Sky FC. The last hour of this game was so insane that it had me standing in my chair the entire time and my jaw dropped to the floor the entire time. it almost made me cry. Rather than wait to play Cold Steel 4, it made me immediately want to jump to Cold Steel 4 to see the aftermath of what went down. Cold Steel 3 is a game that made me feel, and that's why I love it so much. It made me realize that I was all in. It made me remember why I love turn-based RPGs so much, why I love story so much. It inspired me to improve my own writing. And I think that's the ultimate reason why I love it so much and why it's my personal favorite Trails game. And nothing is ever going to change that. Absolutely nothing. My final score for The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 3 is an 11 out of 10. The Legend of Heroes is a franchise that has become near and dear to my heart. Playing these games for the past 7 months now have been an amazing experience that makes me not regret the path I've chosen in life. And even though during this video I absolutely rip into some of the aspects that I'm not the biggest fan of, it comes from a place of wanting the franchise to improve and become better than it already is now. It embodies storytelling and world building so well and mixes dozens of other aspects that makes it a gamers, consumers, and creative paradise. I really hope this video helps you get into Trails if you haven't already done so, because it's a special JRPG franchise, and once you start, you'll never want to put it down. Thank you for watching. See ya. Goodbye.